make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects, and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, never been banned from Facebook or YouTube, never been sabotaged or censored for politely expressing a difference of opinion. Ex-Muslim host Aina, keeping it non-controversial.
Welcome to episode 33. I've got writer Hussein Kesvani here with me today, and he wrote a particularly interesting piece for Mel magazine called Masturbating While Muslim. Hi, Hussein. How's it going?
It's good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No worries. I'm a big fan.
Oh, well, I am a big fan of your interesting writing as well. This is a topic that, I've covered a few times on my blog, but, I started writing about sexuality like 7 years ago. Yeah, so it's been a while since I, dove into that Muslim masturbation online scene.
Yeah.
But you had a lot of interesting details. Like, it's funny. What is happening there? Tell us.
It's a big question. It's a really big question. I guess, so it'd probably be easy to start off with kind of how this kind of came about. Mm-hmm. So a couple of years ago, I was kind of covering issues to British Muslims at BuzzFeed in their office based in London. They wanted to have a beat where we basically told untold stories about British Muslims.
Cool.
So my thing was I wanted to talk about youth culture, and I wanted to talk about this side of you. So before I was at BuzzFeed, I was kind of working on and off for Vice magazine, and as you know, they do a lot of stuff on subcultures. So I wanted to bring some of that over here. And the thing that I saw was that all the kind of media around Muslim issues were largely based on charity. I split it in two ways. It's either doing, inspirational Muslim does charity work, or you'd have a terrorism story. There wasn't really anything. but there wasn't really anything that really detailed the experiences that, I had growing up as a young Muslim online. So I was always been interested in those types of stories. This was something that I wanted to do in 2015. I saw this happening on Facebook forums that I used to follow for my news stuff. Mm-hmm. So you'd always have these conversations, and if you looked at the comment threads, which were often more interesting than the video. So someone would post a video, and the video would say something along the lines of you must keep complete celibacy until you're married. This is what your religion demands of you, etc. But if you looked in the threads, there was much more, there were different opinions about it. Yeah. And there were some people who said, but look, I've been struggling with this and I can't really talk about it because, in my community and in my Masjid, we don't talk about those issues. So this is where the idea came from. And then a couple of months ago, I stumbled upon a Reddit thread, which was called Muslim NoFap.
What is this NoFap? There's a whole community, international NoFap community. And I've seen some YouTube white nationalists that are into, asserting their masculinity through controlling their masturbation.
Yeah. So this comes from Red Pill community. I don't know if you might have listeners who are part of this community and they might get angry with you that I haven't essentialized it properly.
Do you really think I have MRA type listeners?
Oh, you never know. I run a podcast as well, which is about Asian people, and we actually have a couple of those guys that listen to us. So you never know.
Oh, well, they're not going to like a lot of what I say then. But
anything that has ex-Muslims and they're interested in them. So
yeah, that's so
just
true.
a heads up on that.
That's so true.
So there's this community online called Red Pill, and there's various channels of it, but it largely focuses on masculinity, and the standard NoFap thread involves men not self, whatever you want to call it, because they want to
not self, whatever you want to call it.
I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say on this podcast.
Oh, you're allowed to say whatever you want.
Oh, great. Okay, so men who basically refrain from wanking, right? Because they want to a very British term. Because they
I mean, this whole episode is about masturbation, so let's at least not euphemize.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so they don't wank, they don't masturbate because they want to kind of like assert their masculinity, and somehow they want to kind of some people want to reclaim it. They say that, this addiction to kind of pornography in women kind of effeminates them. So that's kind of like your mainstream community. The Muslim NoFap community is a bit different because whereas the normal NoFap community kind of is very much centered on the individual and this idea of the individual gaining control of themselves. The Muslim NoFap community is about kind of returning to like orthodox traditions of Islam, right? It's this idea of like, you kind of control your body for the sake of Allah. You do it for the sake of, the family, so their intentions and their objectives are very, very different. And I became very fascinated with that because it was something that was so obvious but no one was really talking about. There's another thing too, which was, so I'm currently working on a book about British Muslims and the way that they use the web. And one of those big stories is marriage. Like marriage is this huge thing in the Muslim community. And, for men, they kind of go to the Masjid and they, have these circles where they talk about preparations for getting married. So I went to a couple of them for research. And the thing that I noticed was that if you go to these circles, you never spoke about sex. Marriage was always just like, you go speak to the woman's father, you speak to their parents, you get permission to marry them, you get married, and then you have kids. That was literally it. It was just like you get married, you have kids, right? That's your objective. And it's kind of, what about the process that, you have to get, So, that's a really important thing too. And these guys who are going to the Masjid to kind of get marriage advice, they're not, guys who have kind of, played around a bit and then turned to Islam. Like they're people who are very, very religious. Yeah. And they've been religious for a long time and they've grown up with religious families. So what ends up happening is that you have a good portion of these men who are genuinely afraid of what's going to happen when they have to like consummate their marriage. But obviously you're not going to go tell people that, I'm really scared that, and I found that one guy who I referenced in the article, he's from Canada, who said that he had to divorce his wife because, they were married for a few months and he just genuinely didn't know what to do.
Oh no.
Yeah. And he had to go to he chose at that point to go to a proper sex therapist because in Muslim communities, there wasn't anyone who was able to do that. That was like openly, saying that we can kind of do that for you.
Right. We have they have imams that give this marital advice. And I just think that's the worst place to get advice, especially if you're struggling with issues of sexuality, because religion isn't exactly, forthcoming about sex or sexuality, and it kind of doesn't really benefit women to get sex advice. And that's another thing. Like one of the criticisms I got was I didn't really talk about the women's experience. And I thought, Mel is a men's magazine, and I talk about it purely from a male perspective. But I was thinking in the process of writing, imagine what it's like to be a woman. Yeah. Dealing with this. And it's
especially
like zip. There's no mention of it at all. It's like it doesn't exist almost. At least there's some sort of NoFap community that at least acknowledges that masturbation is a thing. But women masturbating in Muslim communities is just unheard of or unspoken about, really. But, when I read that this was an article for Mel magazine, which is a men's magazine, and it's funny because it's indicative of the kind of world and political climate that we're living in now, that my mind immediately goes to, oh my gosh, is this an MRA sort of magazine? So I started looking at their Twitter feed. I'm like, no, it just seems like a regular place that's discussing men's issues. And I never would have had that thought in another year, maybe 5 years ago, or just even a couple of years ago. My mind wouldn't have gone there. But now it's men's issues. Oh gosh, are we talking MRA?
It's kind of I think Mel's an interesting magazine because it kind of, it set out to basically do the opposite of what traditional men's magazines do, right? So it talks a lot about kind of mental health and body. I think there was a really interesting article this week about body acceptance for men, which you wouldn't really hear about in GQ or Esquire and stuff.
Yeah, and it doesn't spend its time shitting on feminists, I noticed.
I think there's quite a lot of women who work for it. So that might be one of the reasons why.
So yeah, I also noticed right at the end of your article, I didn't get a chance to look into this, that you've also written about Muslim MRAs, which is another thing that fascinates me so greatly. But we'll get into that later. Let's talk more about the NoFap Muslim community.
Sure. It's such a complicated community that, like, I mean, I only spent a couple of weeks inside.
Yeah.
So you really kind of got the essential basics, but I feel that, like, there is something more to be written about that space, and hopefully I might be able to write about it in my book when, I go back to it again.
That sounds awesome. What's your book called?
So it doesn't actually have a title yet.
Oh, okay.
The provisional title is called Follow Miyaki, which is the thing that I needed to it's kind of the idea of just like male-dominated social media, and the stuff that kind of these British kids who went over to Syria were kind of telling people when they were trying to get them to go over.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. But I noticed in the masturbation stuff that you were talking about, a lot of it was framed like an addiction, which is something that reminded me of when I went on these forums to write my blog posts and stuff. A lot of it was framed as an illness or an addiction. And then I used to get emails from like Pakistani teenagers as well who were, suffering from this, what they thought was this weakness or this illness. And they actually thought it made them physically ill.
Yeah.
And I don't know, changed the shape of their penises. I got emails about how it was leaking, their penises were leaking stuff, and I'm like, I think that's part of the process. It happens. Yeah. Stuff will come out. You're okay. And one guy had convinced himself that he was in bed because of excessive masturbation, as it was like sapping his life's energy. And I had to send him a bunch of like, medical posts and stuff like, look at this. It's perfectly normal. You're not slowly killing yourself. You're okay. So it's very strange how this is framed. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I would bear in mind is that sometimes those stories can actually be exaggerated. Some of them may not be true. Oh, but I actually spoke to people who believed it themselves. Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's, that's really interesting. I mean, I can only talk about like the people that I interviewed and the people that I'm currently interviewing. Yeah. And I haven't heard kind of any kind of major exaggerating stories, but you're right in saying that a lot of this is framed around addiction. But see, you spoke to Western Muslims mostly, right? I spoke to Pakistani Muslims in Pakistan, so I think that's also a difference. I sort of wondered whether it was about language. So I think even in kind of Western Muslim discourse, when there is still like this aversion to talk very openly about sexuality, that language still exists whether like people like it or not. Everywhere in kind of like Western pop culture, like it exists. So like you can be the most devout Muslim in the world and you still kind of have to confront this type of language, and it'll kind of make you much, much better informed than I would imagine like living in Pakistan would. Yeah, for sure. So I feel that maybe that could be kind of one of the points of difference. But one thing that does resonate is what you were saying about the language of addiction and how this is usually talked about. Because the thing that I was really interested in when I first started writing the piece was about people who were just doing it normally, like just as any other man, I assume, would. Mm-hmm. So they wouldn't necessarily call themselves addicted, but they would kind of say that like this is something wrong and it's not kind of prescribed, we're not allowed to do it according to like this reading of the Quran or the Sunnah or like, these hadiths which say that like it's a major sin. Those are the things I was really interested in, this idea of like denying yourself like something that is very normal for a type of like spiritual purpose that you haven't necessarily defined. And a lot of these guys were just largely focused on marriage, right? So they, for them, they didn't want to get married when they were, in their words, like living in sin, living in zina. And that was the thing that kind of struck me the most. But the people who were more open to talk about were ones who kind of claimed that they were addicted. Yeah, I mean, there's also like a couple of schools of thought on this in Islam, right? There's the one that believes it's basically adultery and you must refrain from masturbating. And then there's a more progressive way of looking at it where it is basically a tool to help you control your sexual desires and prevent you from committing adultery. Yeah. But
the latter of which isn't really prescribed that much. Like even the most progressive imams that I spoke to kind of said that like it's not, they would only go as far as to say it's not a major sin, but it's one of those things that like is disliked, but you won't like go to hell for doing it.
Okay.
Which opens up its own problems, right? And one guy that I referenced in the piece, Mufti Abu Layth, he was like the only imam that I kind of found, and it's worth noting that he's not necessarily kind of an imam in the traditional sense. He is someone who's trained as a scholar in, I think he trained in Saudi, but he basically works as like a youth worker, and he does like Facebook videos where he talks about like Islamic scripture.
Right, and you mentioned that he had like a Facebook Live session where he said that masturbation wasn't prohibited at all, and instead he believes that past Muslim scholars had suggested that masturbation could be used to safely manage one's sexual desires. And was that very controversial? Yeah,
so I mean, I noticed that video on a Facebook page that I follow. So you have all these interesting Facebook discussions that you see on your feed, and they tend to react to things like this, like a lot. So it was like 130 commented thread about like this one topic, and it was very, very controversial because you had on the very extreme end people that were basically saying that he's trying to like encourage zina, and he's trying to encourage young people to like be led astray. And then you have some kind of
Can you explain what zina is just for the listeners?
Sure. So to make it very simple, it's kind of like an ultimate sin or like a major sin.
Okay.
Something that like unless you kind of redeem yourself in the real world, in the world, then you'll be punished in the afterlife.
And isn't it specifically sexual too, zina?
No, I don't think it's necessarily sexual. I think a lot of things that are associated with it are sexual.
Okay.
But I don't think it's holistically like that, but you might want to check that up.
Okay. The other thing that I found funny or amusing, I guess, in your article is that you said that there's a website in the U.S. called Purify Your Gaze.
Yes,
provides
based over North Carolina.
Nice. So anyone needing their services can look them up. Provides interactive sessions via Skype, usually involving a mentor, and other specially designed programs consisting of physical activities and Islamic prayers to aid men throughout their healing processes from porn and masturbation. Yeah. So I really wanted to interview these guys, and they didn't get back to me on time. So hopefully I'm going to be doing a longer interview with them for my book. The way I found out about them was through the Muslim NoFap Reddit thread, because there were a few people that used it. There was like various mixed reviews about how useful they were. Their attitude was kind of like, the way that imams currently do this is that they kind of either do, at the most extreme end, they'll do like ruqya, right? So they'll do like exorcisms. And at the kind of other more moderate end, they'll kind of sit you down and talk about, when you kind of feel these urges, then fast or pray or do both. Fasting is like the most common kind of thing that they recommend that you do. These guys basically say that like you need to take a more holistic approach if you're going to kind of, get people to, stop being addicted to pornography or masturbation or like, just getting these urges. So I'm not kind of sure what the specifics are, because I wanted to go into one of these classes and I wasn't allowed to for like reasons of sensitivity. But what I was told by other people that use the site was that you kind of have these one-to-one sessions with a guy who, either runs a website or kind of is associated with the website. They would kind of talk to you about why you're feeling certain ways or why you're feeling certain things, what triggers kind of lead you to that. So one of the guys who used the site kind of said that his main trigger was like going to the beach. And whenever he went to the beach, because he wanted to kind of get away and just like, he really liked looking at the ocean, he would see like these women in bikinis. This very very standard kind of story that you expect of a teenager, but not necessarily of a 28-year-old man. Yeah, I don't know. Is that something that like I can't relate to being aroused by just seeing people in their bathing suits? So is that how often does that like is that I don't know how to phrase this sensitively for men in general, but
men just go for it, like just be as blooded.
Is that normal? Like, I mean, is that a result of coming from a culture where you're not around people of the opposite sex, you're repressed sexually, or do people just get aroused to the point of wanting to masturbate when they're on the beach?
I think it's more the latter. Like I'd be very careful about kind of saying that it's something to do with like, repression, because you have guys from like very open sexual environments who kind of do the same thing and have the same like lack of control and stuff, right? Like
they just need to get away for a bit and just jerk off because they're at the beach.
Yeah, I mean, I assume so. Just like normal guys who like lack self-control. I guess it's harder when you come from an environment where like you're kind of, not really told what you do when you're in that type of situation, or like you don't have friends to talk to. Like, I come from like a moderately conservative Muslim household, and I never had the talk. I was never kind of talked to, my cousins never talked to me about this. My uncles never did. My dad and my mum didn't. But because I went to an English school and I was kind of one of 3 Muslim students there, you had places to talk about this stuff that were very open, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of these guys, they go to schools that are largely dominated by Muslims. They come from very conservative Muslim households. Religion, like, is the most important thing in their lives. Mm-hmm. So there isn't really that space to kind of talk about those things. And when you're in those types of situations, the advice that like imams give you in those situations are like, lower your gaze, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, like, you're going out in the street and like looking down at the floor when you're walking, which is like sort of ridiculous when you kind of think about it, right?
It completely is. Yeah, I've been on the receiving end of that, like at distant family members gatherings where people that are very, very religious, they won't even look me in the eye, and I find it a bit offensive because they'll shake my husband's hand, at least look at him, acknowledge his presence, but they'll just like look at the floor and just walk past me, and I'm like, that's really rude. I mean, I come from a Muslim family. I know where it's coming from.
And I mean, even when I go to like family events, and these are like close family events, they still have the curtain up.
Do they?
Still like to like Yeah, I'm not joking. They still have the curtain up.
I get really mad when I'm in a segregated gathering. I can't deal with it very well.
Yeah, and I think I grew up in that type of environment, so like I suppose I sort of normalized it. But now, kind of like being a writer and like working in various different worlds, you kind of deal with it, but at the same time you sort of think that like, imagine if you're like a young kid and this is like the stuff you're growing up with, right?
So then you go to the beach, and then obviously you're going to need to jerk off if you see a person in a bikini.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of like, I'm not saying that's like a bad thing. What I kind of tried to warn about in the article is that like actually the consequences can be a lot worse, because if you don't know how to manage yourself and you don't know how to manage these very complicated emotions and feelings, God knows what's going to happen to you, right? Yeah. And thankfully lots of Muslims come out normally and they kind of learn about it themselves, but there is, a fair amount of people who don't.
Of course, there's a whole range.
Another thing that I was really interested in was like all these like young Muslim men who are getting married, right? In one of the classes that I shadowed for my research, one of the bits of advice was like, get married when you're young. So they're basically encouraging like 16, 17-year-olds to get married, right?
Yeah, I've heard that before.
And you can imagine the reason why they're saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they say, well, okay, well, during those moments when you feel those things, and 16 is a bit of a weird age to say like, this is the moment when you feel stuff, right? I just felt that was kind of very strange advice.
It's the worst advice possible. I have someone that I know that brought this up, that her son was, getting to university age, and how she wanted him to get married before he went to college. And I'm like, that's a terrible idea. He has no way of looking after himself right now. How is he going to be a married person? How is this going to be a responsible relationship? He knows nothing, and you're as a parent recommending that he get married. I mean, it was just. I
mean, a lot of these parents kind of say that, like, we'll look after, wife and husband, or in Britain anyway. among like a certain class of like middle class, upper middle class Muslims, you have these uncles that are like, we'll buy you a house, we'll buy you everything that you need, so you just have to focus on studying and like
just
enjoying
so that they don't have sexual desires. I mean, it's
in university. And my thing was like, okay, if you want to do that, then fine. Like, I don't necessarily have like a major issue with it. My kind of concern was more just like, to be married and to have like a functional relationship, like you need to be emotionally ready for that.
Exactly.
And if you've kind of been told like you're not allowed to have like relationships, and like preferably you're not allowed to talk to women unless you have to, how the hell are you going to be like emotionally ready for that? It's just, I don't know. For me, like it felt that it was kind of like this tinderbox, but I know that there's lots of kind of Muslim guys who disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you're setting them up for failure. And on the other end, I've also heard from people who have been in these arranged marriages that people have less expectations when they're not like, people that fall in love. It's kind of sad, but it's like a business arrangement. So you make it work, and then eventually you grow to like each other. Yeah,
I mean, I don't really know much about that, and like I'm not kind of there to judge. Like I've seen lots of marriages that like start off that way and end really badly, but I've seen marriages that do really well and they thrive from that. So I'm not really there to judge, but I do kind of get concerned that if your motivation to get married is largely to kind of regulate some sort of like sexual desire, then that's not a good way to start.
That's the worst reason to get married.
Yeah.
But it's not just these online communities that recommend this stuff. I have seen there was like a health show where they took live calls from Pakistan that was on a couple of years ago, and
best type of shows.
Pardon?
The best type of shows.
And so this doctor got this call from a woman. I don't know if it was like a real issue or someone was just trolling him, but she was like, oh, I have this problem and I like to masturbate a lot. And it really threw him off visibly. And then she's like, well, what do you recommend I do? And instead of saying, oh, it's a normal human function or whatever, he's like, oh, well, you should dedicate yourself to prayer, and I prescribe reading more scripture. And I'm like, this is a doctor. It's so so he's legitimizing this view that it's a problem, and his prescription is to just pray the horniness away.
Pray and fast, right?
Yeah.
Those are the magic bullets.
Yeah, because I guess if you're starving, you're not going to feel much else except for hunger.
I think for them, it's kind of like when you're fasting, you're kind of religiously like invested. So you'll make a more conscious decision kind of not to do that stuff.
But that's not true, though. I mean, I was in Saudi for many Ramadans, and trust me, I mean, people try to change during Ramadan. There was people who would stop drinking or just stop drinking for the holiest night of Ramadan, which I always found to be such a sham, right? If you believe in this almighty creator, who are you fooling, really? That you're doing this sinful thing the rest of the year, but on the holiest night, you're just not going to do it and all will be forgiven? I don't know.
Yeah, I think because there is a tradition in Islam of call it this idea of you can be redeemed at any time. So long as you're fully invested and you kind of, say the right stuff. That kind of people take advantage of that.
The loophole.
That's an observation. I don't have any evidence to back up. So,
but I saw people breaking their fasts with a beer or a joint and just refraining from doing that on the 27th night of Ramadan. So that's what I'm saying. It's not really. It doesn't change much.
Yeah.
And then they judge other people. They judge other people that are also having the beer on the 27th night of Ramadan. So it's a very, it's like, I don't know, you're not fooling anyone. So I don't know if the fasting will do anything.
It doesn't. I spoke to people who were just we fasted. And then when we broke our fast at 9 p.m., we just went and did it.
See?
So this is kind of okay, so you stopped yourself from doing it during the day. But the moment you got some food in you,
Yeah. Well, you're also supposed to refrain from sexuality, even if you're married and totally in a halal relationship while you're fasting, right? So
yes, yeah.
I guess.
It's a bit tricky. I mean, I don't really have like a major opinion on that, but
yeah, that's okay. No, I'm just saying that kind of links to the sex negativity that I see. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you religious?
Sort of. I wouldn't. I think some people would view me as quite religious, and other people wouldn't. But yeah, I mean, I don't drink. I kind of fast during Ramadan. I pray. So yeah, but also at the same time, like, I would identify as like quite liberal.
Yeah.
Which means that some people would not view me as like religious, right, or like secular. So I don't really know how to define myself, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess it depends on who you ask, right?
Yeah.
Someone on the halal NoFap community would probably find you not acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a few Salafi communities that like I've written about who kind of have used the K word in reference to me, which has been
kafir?
very... Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which I've kind of like brushed off a bit, but I've been told by other people, like, don't, be a bit careful when you write about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, you got to be careful. Anyone can be deemed the K word at any point in time, right?
Yep.
And you've got your whole face and name out there, so I would recommend being careful.
Yeah,
but
I try my best. I tell my mum I try my best anyway. So,
are your parents concerned ever that you write about these topics?
Yeah. I mean, every so often they'll just be like, "Look, do you just want to go and become a lawyer? Like, we'll pay for you to go to law school." It was more because when I first started out doing journalism, I was doing really dangerous stories to kind of get my name out there. So I kind of wrote stories about like exorcisms and what else did I do? I kind of interviewed like members of gangs.
Wow.
And I didn't tell my parents what I was doing. I was just like, I'm just going out to see my mate. And actually, like, we went to some very dodgy part of London to talk. So when they found out all about that, and they usually find out about it after I publish stuff. Mm-hmm. So like my mum will come in and be like, why did you do this? Like, how did this come about? But they're generally like quite supportive of what I do. So
did your parents ever have a sex talk with you?
No.
Never, eh?
Nope.
But your school?
Yeah, so like, in the UK it's really weird because their version of like sex talk is like video. So we watch this very weird kind of sciencey video where like cartoons, and like this, like, watching cartoons, like,
have sex,
be intimate. It's really, really weird. As anyone from like the red pill community will tell you. So it wasn't really, I mean, the way that you learn about stuff is through your mates, right? They would come and tell you about things that they definitely didn't do, but would say they would. And you would kind of go from there. And like, to be honest, like the way that we learn about all this stuff is through the internet, right?
Yeah.
And that's where people are still learning about these things. And I think for like parents will kind of, what I found interesting is that some people kind of said that like parents assume that like madrasa should teach you about this stuff, and the madrasa said that your parents should teach you about, sex. So as a result, like no one's kind of teaching these kids anything, and the responsibility is being like thrown onto other people to do this stuff.
Yeah, and in Canada we have like some Salafis picking up the slack.
So they're very keen on talking about it.
In their own propaganda way. Yeah.
But if you look on videos online, the people who are talking about sex are like, these like street dawah guys, these Salafi imams, these people who are very, very dangerous, but they're also like the people who are most openly talking about these things.
Yeah, for all the wrong reasons, like instilling shame and stuff in little kids. Like there was a Muslim sex ed hashtag or something, and there's this Salafi feminist person who does these talks at mosques, and she talked on the radio about how the bath is a good time to teach the kids about modesty and haya, which means shame. It just, I don't know, it disturbed me because that's...
And isn't that a really interesting thing too? Like, you know, we were talking about language earlier, and, you know, a lot of that language is centered around shame, and a lot of it is centered around modesty. There's not really a lot of language that kind of looks at Islam through the lens of like intimacy.
Though there are some hadiths that talk about foreplay and, you know, sex positivity. It's very strange, the contradictions and the priorities. Like there was, I think, one hadith that talked about it being completely barbaric if you have sex without foreplay. But then other times, you know, there's shady stuff that is permissible. So I don't know.
And I think in that ambiguity, you then open up this vacuum where people can kind of take these extreme positions.
Yeah, they pick what they
really
want.
Get checked up on it.
It's funny. You're in a coffee shop, right? Because I think I can hear the.
Yeah. There's coffee shop upstairs.
But anyways, let's move on.
You wanted to talk about MRAs, right?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Before we get there, there's the ending quote of your article, which made me. Gave me mixed feelings, really. Kind of made me sad for the guy and made me laugh a bit too, because he's like, I'm fine during the day when I can control my temptations. It's moments at night when I'm alone, he admits. He takes a long pause and then mutters a short prayer in Arabic, asking for God's forgiveness. Those are the times I'm worried about. It's at nighttime when the devil likes to tempt us, especially on the internet.
So there's a bit of a story about that, because when I submitted my first draft, he kind of ended it where he just said, at night is where I'm worried, right? And then when I submitted to my editor, he was like, oh, we really need like a punchier ending. So I had to like ring him again, like ask him more questions. So that's really like an amalgamation of stuff, which he just kind of said, yeah, that's good, and you can print that. So as an ending, I think it kind of adds a certain aura that maybe the phone call that I had with him didn't necessarily exude. But maybe that's because I've spoken to him quite a lot. Sorry, I derailed you. So,
it's just
why did it, like, how did it make you feel?
Yeah, it just made me sad that there's this person kind of in this self-loathing, believing that the devil is causing him to have these desires at night. Yeah. And it just must be a really shitty existence to live like that. And then it's also funny because, I mean, he literally believes the devil is making him think naughty things. Yeah.
I mean, when you're kind of taught sex ed in Islamic context, like that's kind of the thing that always pops up, right?
The devil?
Like any types of temptation come from the shaitan, which they kind of changed the devil. But the original kind of thing that he said was about the shaitan. So I think for him that was like a very normal thing. And like when you speak to him about things that aren't to do with like this subject, he'll kind of bring up the shaitan quite often. So he'll kind of say, you know, we spoke a bit about a house that he's trying to buy at the moment, and how, like, you know, Allah has rewarded him by giving him enough to like put a down payment on a house. But he's very worried that like the shaitan will kind of come and like ruin that for him and his mum. And he just says it very, very openly. So this is very much like part of his day to day.
So then when he's paying like his mortgage payments with interest, isn't that going to be like the shaitan's part in it?
Oh, no. He told me he got a halal loan.
Oh, where they call interest something else.
Where like he's basically like borrowed money from like another source and like riba. I mean, I should have really spoken to him more about that in hindsight. But yeah, he told me that he got a halal loan. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on some advertising stuff when I was in Pakistan a long time ago. And one of the clients for the agency, one of the clients was a halal banking person, and we had to make a brochure, and even the guy himself was laughing about how it's exactly the same thing, but they call the word interest something else, like profit. And then that satisfies this need for a lot of people who don't like regular banking.
The biggest provider of like halal loans in the UK is like a Qatari bank. Which I find really funny, just for obvious reasons of like, these like oil sheikhs are like, putting like a halal masquerade, and you've got these like Muslims who like really hate Qatar and they hate Al Jazeera, but they'll still take these loans from the Qatari bank.
Of course, yeah.
Because, they don't use the term interest, and you'll get like emails. I get emails like once every kind of couple of weeks telling me that like, go take out a halal loan and, stuff like that. You've got like, the Emir of Qatar at like the bottom of the email. So I find that whole space really interesting. But yeah, like back to the point that you were talking about, he uses these terms very, just in day-to-day conversation. So I think what sounded really dramatic in the article may not have necessarily been so dramatic to him.
Just the bringing up of Satan is like just a regular...
It's a normal thing.
It's a normal thing, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's going back to language, right? And like how we talk about, sex ed. And this is still the language that's like largely dominant. If you're going to go to the Masjid, these are the types of, these are the types of things that are going to be said in that context. So he's just thinking in those terms. And if you look at Muslim NoFap, like, they also use those terms as well. I think because of the internet, because of like the fact that it exists on Reddit and like lots of people go on different Reddit forums, it's less obvious, but they still think about, sex in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I find that the world is shrinking too, right? So probably the Muslim NoFap Reddit has checked out the other NoFap Reddits, and things are just starting to come face to face with each other. So at some point I feel like they're going to have to confront the idea of whether they want to bring Satan into everything little, or whether it's an abstract concept or like a real guy that's hovering above them and making their dicks hard. So it's strange. The internet brings so many different communities and cultures together that the contrast of this stuff seems silly right now, but I feel like it's as the world shrinks, we might lose some of it, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is kind of one of the reasons why I started on this book, right? Like, I just kind of felt that, like, these conversations about Islam and stuff are, like, changing a lot because of the web.
Yeah.
And because of the fact that, like, loads of things are converging, young Muslims kind of have to now rethink the way that they see themselves as Muslims, right?
Yeah, I think that's such a great idea, too, because these are areas that are not talked about Muslims, as you mentioned earlier, right? It's either like a terrorist story or like some religious charity story, some feel good. So, there are lots of subcultures and things going on, which would actually serve to normalize Muslims for the greater climate in the West right now. I think it would be very beneficial to do such a thing. I mean, of course we have our anti-masturbation Reddit threads, and of course we have our strange MRA subcultures, and they're not necessarily great, but they are totally in line with what's happening on the non-Muslim side of the world, right? So, and that brings me to asking you about Muslim MRAs.
Oh, this is a really interesting subject. It kind of started off in the same way. So this was my first story for Mel, when Mel were like a newish place, and I was just very intrigued about the things that they were writing. But the story actually came from a guy called Nabil Aziz.
I've heard of this guy. Oh my gosh!
Yeah, you should have him on the show. He's interesting, but like he's.
I don't know if I have the strength to, but.
Yeah, you'll have to. Do you drink coffee?
No, I don't.
Well, whatever like you use to kind of like regulate, your feelings, like you'll have to like bring a lot of that.
Wine.
Yeah, you might have to do that. So Nabil was interesting because he was like this Muslim guy who like kept popping up on all these alt-right spaces. So there's a guy called Mike Cernovich.
Yes, I know him very well. Who
has blocked me because I made a joke about him.
What a snowflake.
So, and he and Nabil were talking about, I was like, okay, Mike Cernovich is really worried about like a Muslim invasion in the US, yet like this guy who like identifies as like a conservative Muslim is like being mates with him. Like, this is really weird. And I was looking at Nabil's profile more, and he runs this website called Being an Alpha Muslim, and he like hangs out in lots of these like MRA red pill groups. But he basically says that like I take a really different approach, because like while these red pill groups are very individualized and they're about kind of improvement of the self and like to kind of assert your masculinity, what being an Alpha Muslim is like ultimately like your obligation is to God, and like you're going to be a man that like God, Allah has like designed you to be. And his thing is just like, Muslim feminists have like effeminated Muslim men, and and it can
This
be
is so
really
bizarre, because it's just a flip of the other MRA coin, but just
basically like an Islamized version of normal MRA culture, right?
Yeah.
But it kind of includes things where like, so where some of MRA culture is about like asserting your alpha dominance over women, like in his kind of version is like, well, you getting married to a woman is like a given anyway if you're from a Muslim household or family, so this is how you should act like a man, right? So that means like reading the history of Prophet Muhammad and like trying to imitate him, and looking at the way his decorum towards his wives, and that's how you should be treating your wife as well. I know that like if he listens to this, like he'll kind of say that I've completely got him wrong.
Of course, that's what they all say. But
he wrote like a big riposte of my article on his website, which was more of just like, you defined how I define myself incorrectly. But I feel like I feel that like that's kind of his sort of gig, right? If you look at his Twitter feed, like he kind of has fights with feminists.
Yeah.
Especially if they're Muslim feminists, and he'll be like very, very aggressive about it. But at the same time, like, he'll go after like these alt-right guys who are anti-Muslim.
But that's all of them almost. So
yeah.
What's going on?
It's just this very weird space that he's like a very fringe part of, but an interesting fringe. So he's kind of like the go-to guy, because he's the most public guy and he wants to be in the media and stuff like that. The actual other MRAs tend to be more hidden. So these are guys who kind of like sympathize with like alt-right ideology, but they don't like the fact that it's inherently anti-Muslim. So they would be very happy like doing the MRA thing if it was just about, bad talking feminists and, asserting your dominance over your wife or whatever. But they're very uncomfortable with the idea that like actually these alt-right guys are genuinely convinced that there's going to be like an Islamic invasion.
I mean, that should clue them into how stupid their other ideas are. But,
this is my thing. I was kind of like, one of the cores of like alt-right ideology is like the idea that like, Islam is like the existential enemy. Like one of the interesting things about the MRA culture is how like some of them have kind of embraced Christianity and like, very, this very weird form of Christianity, which kind of harks back to the Crusades.
And for me as an atheist, it's very disturbing to see some atheists kind of follow along and overlap with this and kind of become Christianity apologists, because I'm like, I thought we were not into religion, and now we're like apologizing for one of them so that we can hate on another one even more.
So this is really interesting. So I don't know, I'm reading this new book by a guy called Douglas Murray right now.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. Okay. So you guys don't like, so he's obviously, what he's like, right?
Yes,
so
I do.
His new book kind of essentializes the argument that you just made, right?
Yeah.
Which is, Douglas is an atheist. He's never going to be religious. But what he says is that, like, it would be a shame if the churches went, because, this outward version of Christianity is like what defines Western civilization. And I think a lot of these guys kind of take from that. Like, they're not interested in the theology. They're not interested in kind of like biblical argument. They're there for aesthetics, and like the alt-right is inherently an aesthetic movement.
Yeah, but it's also about like the superiority, right? The civilized Christianity, and the Christianity brought about these amazing human rights, whereas Islam is this evil, barbaric religion that's taking over and Islamizing the West, and Sharia law is everywhere, and the immigrants are coming in and breeding too much, and the white people are becoming minorities. And I mean, Douglas also has some fears about white Britons becoming a minority. which he's made clear in a few places. So
yeah. I mean, like, if you read his book, it's really just like an amalgamation of his columns, like combined with.
That sounds delightful. I'll be buying it immediately.
Well, luckily, I got a review copy, so I wasn't prepared to pay like £20 to buy it. Yeah. He captures like this argument that like the alt-right, I feel like more mainstream alt-righters kind of embrace, and Nabil kind of, he takes some of that, but he doesn't take other bits in. So, and when I asked him, like, he doesn't really define himself as alt-right, even though he kind of ticks loads of boxes.
Yeah.
But that's another thing with this movement, right? Like, they are happy to embrace the name when it suits them, but they're not happy when you kind of call them up on it.
So it's like Nabil is happy to hate on women so much that he's willing to ignore the bigotry towards Muslims in the alt-right. So he retweets and cites them all the time. Does that sound fair?
I'm sure he wouldn't find that fair.
Of course he wouldn't find it fair.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of capturing that. And also just like, the thing that he's attracted to the most is like this whole idea of like being alpha and being masculine, right? So
at any cost. It's funny because I saw him post, I think, an excerpt or a link to an article from this guy called Vox Day.
Yes, yeah. So he's like he's like a Christian alt-writer.
Yeah, and he wrote this article about how marriage equals consent. And so once you're married to someone, you don't need their consent. Like that in itself was the consent. So there's no such thing as marital rape.
Yes, I think I read this before.
It's so disturbing. This is exactly the kind of shit the extremist mullahs are saying, and people in the West are like, "Oh my gosh, that's so it's so backward and barbaric and horrific." But now these alt-right guys have started to spin it as well, and now there's this convergence of this alpha Muslim bullshit. And
I don't know if you're familiar with a guy called Rushdi.
Yeah.
So when I was researching that article, like the thing that started off was an article that I saw on Rushdi's website, which was about whether Islam is red pill or not. And his argument was very similar. But his thing was just like, and he literally starts with this thing like, I know we're all worried about Islam and we're all worried about how it's going to like dilute Western civilization. And like Rushdi, like he's Iranian, like he's an Iranian.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think he's like half Muslim as well, but I'm not sure. So he does this article where it's like, but we can learn some stuff from Islam. The way that they treat their women, the way that,
oh my gosh,
the way that they treat their children. So like, just because we're against it doesn't mean that we can't kind of learn things from it as well. And actually, like, I admire parts of like the biography of Muhammad.
Islam is red pill has to be the greatest article title ever.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just like, it was this really surprising thing to read. And then I searched on Facebook and I found that like all these groups that like I follow had like shared it, and they shared it very sincerely, and none of them really knew who Rushdi was. I don't know.
And Rushdi is like this pro-rape guy, right? Didn't he say something about it being okay to rape a woman if she's on your property? But then he kind of backed away from that and said he didn't really mean it. So I don't.
Yeah, so he was on a BBC documentary. And he had written a book where like this segment basically said that like, this is why consent doesn't actually mean what consent is. And the host of this BBC documentary called him up on it, and, basically like Rush couldn't answer it. And then he did this like 20-minute YouTube video where he was just like, the BBC stung me. They misrepresented my statements. As you do.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, this is so bizarre. It's so bizarre to see these movements coming together, like the misogyny from the East and the misogyny from the West coming together in this nice, beautiful MRA package. Even though the alt-right doesn't like Islam or Muslims often. Yeah. It's strange.
It tells us a lot about the internet, right? It tells us a lot about, like, when we go online, we search for the things that we want to search, and we take bits from certain places that, people don't. I feel that this is like one of the kind of big gaps that we've had when we've talked about how people get like radicalized online, for example. There's this assumption that like you'll go into this wormhole and you'll like absorb everything. When I think the reality is that there's some tenets that like you already believe in and the internet kind of just like, or certain areas of the internet kind of affirm those beliefs, and they don't all come from one person, right? They come from like communities and networks which are all like inherently linked together.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's possible for some people, but for me, I find it. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine joining a movement which I loathe parts of, just because I also agree with some parts. It's like me joining up with, I don't know, Salafis to hate on the alt-right. I fucking hate the alt-right, but I certainly am not going to, hold hands with Salafists to do it. Or, I mean, I'm not going to join the alt-right to hate on Salafists either. So,
you're right.
But some people find it convenient. Yeah, absolutely. So it's strange.
Yeah, and you can. I mean, it's even in in leftist online movements that kind of happens, right? And like, I think one of the interesting things that we've seen about like the mainstream alt-right right now is that they were a lot more unified in the 2016 election, but now the divides are coming up. So like you've got all these really famous alt-right guys who are falling out with each other and calling each other cucks, and it's like really funny to watch.
It's beautiful,
It's really, really funny to watch.
Yeah, one of them argued with Mike Cernovich over doing the Hitler salute, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
what a cuck.
And it's just but that sort of indicates just like the limits of how far like networking can go, but it does tell us a lot about how people become attracted to these movements. And I just generally not convinced that like some innocent kid buys a laptop and then like a month later they go and become like an alt-right guy or a jihadist or whatever.
And it's interesting to me that there are all these ideological purity tests, even in the alt-right and on the right. Yet it's the left that always gets, tarred for, oh, look, they eat their own, and they have all these ideological purity tests. But they exist on the right too. They're just never ever framed like that or brought up. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting. It can be very tiring to watch, but it is very interesting.
Yeah, it's a crazy mess right now. But I'll be keeping an eye on that Muslim MRA thing. I'm definitely very fascinated by that.
I'm hoping to do more, and I'm just hoping to like find out how deep this rabbit hole goes, because I wrote that story in a week, so I didn't really have a lot of time to research. But I do genuinely feel like the hole is a lot deeper. And actually, I feel that like it's not really rooted in the Western world. I feel these things are actually probably a lot more prevalent in like South Asia and the Middle East.
Would they be MRAs then? They're just regular, I don't know, guys. Islamists or regular guys. They're not MRAs. Yeah. Like the government in Pakistan is MRA. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's red pill, man. You're right. I think just because like in the Western world, because I think even if you're kind of one of those Muslims who would be susceptible to these types of emotions and beliefs, from my observation anyway, like most of these guys won't latch on to like MRA or like red pill and stuff, like maybe like people like Nabil will, because they don't want to be part of a movement that is inherently anti-Muslim, right? And this is what I see as well. Like there's guys on my Facebook feed who like post anti-feminist stuff, but they will never kind of like say, hey, I read Guerrilla Mindset and you should buy it. They wouldn't actually do that. So for them, like they can identify what's anti-Muslim and what isn't, even if like they believe certain things. You have to be like a certain type of person to kind of go beyond that and kind of embrace red pill with all its warts and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, on a more mainstream scale, that's kind of what, Muslims for Trump did, right? Or gays for Trump or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
So supporting someone on something because you hate something else so much that you're willing to overlook that this movement also hates you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Strange phenomenon.
It's just the internet, man. It's just, I don't know, it's this weird place that
maybe it's always been like this, but now we can observe these little movements much more clearly because they're documented.
This is a very interesting thing because you're right. So actually like these movements like red pill and like NoFap and stuff have existed for years. Like I remember like 2004, 2005, like there was a forum called Totsi, which was really just there for like computer nerds and stuff, and they used to talk about this stuff, right? And it was all kind of rooted in like cyberculture and libertarianism and stuff. And a lot of the conversations that are now going into the mainstream and things that you see in like the New York Times and stuff were conversations that like they were having, on these forums back in the day. And like I used to spend hours on these forums just like fascinated with these guys with really problematic opinions.
Yeah, and I mean, you just now said cyberculture, and it's a word that I haven't heard in a while. Like cyber seems an outdated word now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, we can't really separate it. And that's the weird thing about the moment that we live in, which is that like when internet culture like breaks out.
Yeah, like back in, I don't know, in the early 2000s, cyber was attached to everything. And, in the goth subculture, which I was, a part of, cyber was attached to every goth night. Like, I don't know, there was a cyber this and a cyber that. I don't know. It's funny, but you don't hear that word anymore.
Yeah, I think just
that.
Because like, there's this acceptance that, we're all like connected and, our lives are in one way or another, cyber.
Yeah.
To put it like that.
Yeah. Now everyone just uses internet. Cyber.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it as well.
Keep me posted on any more Muslim MRA stuff because
I will. I'll send you like messages as soon as I find interesting stuff.
Cool. There
will be more stuff in my book, which should be out next year. So
yeah. So tell people where they can find you, where they can follow you, where they can read your work.
Sure. So my Twitter is @HKesvani. I use it a lot. So like, just like follow me in DM, whatever. I'm freelance right now. So I usually write for Vice magazine. It's obviously vice.com, but I do write for various places, Guardian, Independent, Private Eye. And my book is out with Hearst Publishers, which is a UK-based publisher, and that should be out in March next year. Fingers crossed.
Very cool.
Cool. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, you take care.
You too. Bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/nicemangoes. No E in mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter @nicemangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no E in mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too. A special thanks to Dylan Beck for theme music, sound, and production help.